The morning sun broke across Nellie's Air Force Base in Nevada like a paintbrush across a canvas. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood in the flight hangar, staring at the pre-flight checklist for her F-16 Fighting Falcon. Her hands moved through the motions with the kind of precision that came from thousands of hours of training. Around her, the vast space echoed with the sounds of maintenance crews, warning beeps, and the steady hum of jet engines being tested. Sarah had been a pilot for 12 years. 12 years of waking up before dawn, of pushing her body to limits most people would never understand, of living with the constant pressure that one mistake could mean death. And yet, in all that time, there was still one thing she couldn't seem to escape: the doubt in other people's eyes. "Morning, Captain," called out Lieutenant Joe Carlson, one of the younger pilots. He walked past her with his flight suit unzipped, radiating the kind of easy confidence that came from being handed respect on a silver platter. Joe came from a military family. His father had been a general. His grandfather had flown fighters in Vietnam. In the fighter-pilot community, that kind of pedigree mattered. It mattered a lot. Sarah nodded at him but didn't waste energy on small talk. She was too focused on her aircraft. This would be a routine patrol over the Nevada desert, a training exercise that had been scheduled for weeks. Nothing special, nothing dangerous, just another day in the life of someone who had chosen to serve her country. "I heard they're thinking about pulling you from the rotation," Joe said, stopping mid-stride. He turned back to face her, and there was something almost sympathetic in his expression. Almost. "Command thinks maybe it's time you considered other career options, flight instruction, desk work, roles where you don't have to keep up with the younger guys." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't look up from her checklist. "I keep up just fine," she said quietly. "Of course you do," Joe said, and she could hear the patronizing smile in his voice without even looking at him. "That's not what I mean, it's just, you've had a great run. 12 years is nothing to sneeze at. Maybe it's time to think about settling down a little bit. Start a family, let the new blood take over." He walked away before she could respond, which was probably for the best. Sarah had heard variations of this conversation 100 times. Sometimes it came from superior officers who meant well. Sometimes it came from peers who saw her as competition. And sometimes it came from people like Joe, who simply couldn't reconcile the idea that a woman, especially a woman in her early 40s, belonged in the cockpit of a fighter jet. Sarah had served in 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. She had flown 17 combat missions. She had logged more flight hours than 90% of the pilots on this base, and her record was spotless. Not a single incident, not a single mistake that had cost anyone their life, and yet the whispers never stopped. The doubts never faded. She finished her checklist and walked toward the flight briefing room. The walls were lined with photographs of pilots throughout history, men in flight suits from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, and Iraq and Afghanistan. There were a few women scattered throughout the displays, but not many. Sometimes Sarah wondered if she was fighting history itself, not just the people in the present. The briefing was routine. Captain Marcus Webb, the mission leader, stood at the front of the room with a map of the Nevada desert spread across a screen behind him. Marcus was fair-minded, one of the few senior officers who didn't seem to have an agenda when it came to Sarah. He treated her the way he treated everyone else, as a pilot, not as a woman or a problem to be managed. "We've got a training exercise today," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chatter of the assembled pilots. 2-day simulation. We'll be sweeping across this section of the desert, practicing our evasion and engagement tactics. Weather looks clear. No major complications expected. This is meant to be a good training opportunity, and I expect everyone to take it seriously. Sarah sat in her assigned seat, 2 rows back. Joe was in the front row, of course. He always positioned himself where he could be seen. "One more thing," Marcus continued. "We've got new simulation tech in place. Your radar systems will be linked to the command center here. They'll be tracking everything in real time. Nothing that happens out there will be invisible to us. The more data we collect, the better we can train the next generation of pilots." Sarah nodded. She knew the new system. It was state-of-the-art technology, a quantum leap forward in how the Air Force tracked and monitored its aircraft. Every maneuver, every turn, every altitude change would be recorded. It was actually comforting in a way. She had nothing to hide. The briefing continued for another 15 minutes. Weather patterns, communication protocols, emergency procedures. When it was finished, the pilots filed out and headed toward their aircraft. Sarah walked out to her F-16, pulling on her flight gear as she went. Her crew chief, Sergeant Danny Rodriguez, was waiting for her. Danny was in his 50s, a career Air Force man who had been a crew chief for almost 30 years. He had worked with hundreds of pilots, and he knew better than anyone when someone had what it took and when they didn't. "Looking good today, Captain," Danny said, offering her a step up into the cockpit. "You ready to show them what you're made of?" "Just another training day," Sarah said, though she appreciated his support. Everyone noticed the way things were going. Everyone could see the writing on the wall. She settled into the cockpit, and Danny began the final checks. The safety straps pulled tight across her chest and legs. The helmet came down and locked into place. The radio crackled to life as the flight crew communicated with ground control. "All set, Captain," Danny said through the headset. "Aircraft is good to go. Fly safe out there." "Copy that," Sarah responded. The engine roared to life. The F-16 began to taxi toward the runway. Around her, 4 other jets moved into formation. Joe was in the jet to her right. 2 junior pilots rounded out the formation. Marcus, the mission commander, would be flying in the lead. As Sarah accelerated down the runway, she felt something shift inside her. In the air, none of the doubts mattered. In the air, she wasn't a woman fighting against expectations. She was simply a pilot doing what she did best, and what she did best was fly. The wheels left the ground, the desert spread out beneath her. The sky opened up in all its infinite possibilities. For a moment, just a moment, everything was perfect. Everything made sense. If Sarah had known that this would be the last moment of her old life, she might have held on to it a little longer. But she didn't know. None of them did. They were just pilots heading out for a training exercise on a clear morning in Nevada. It was a morning that would change everything. The flight formations had been airborne for 18 minutes when the anomaly appeared on the radar screens back at Nellis Air Force Base. In the command center, a vast room filled with monitors and tracking systems, Lieutenant Colonel David Harrison sat at his station, watching the green blips that represented the 5 F-16s moving across the desert. The exercise was going according to plan. The pilots had completed their first set of practice maneuvers. They were about to begin the engagement simulation when something happened that no one expected. One of the radar contacts flared on the screen. It wasn't dramatic, nothing catastrophic or obvious. It was just a slight distortion in the signal, like someone had jarred a television antenna. But Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had been monitoring radar for 23 years, and he had learned to pay attention to things that didn't belong. "We getting some interference?" he asked, leaning forward and tapping the monitor. The young radar operator, Airman First Class Tommy Chen, was already on it. His fingers flew across his keyboard, running diagnostics on the system. "No interference reported, sir. All systems showing green. Whatever that was, it's clean now." On the monitor, the blip that had flared straightened out. Everything returned to normal. 5 fighters moving in formation across the desert sky. Harrison sat back in his chair, probably nothing. The new system was still being calibrated. Glitches happened with new technology all the time. Up in the air, Captain Sarah Mitchell had no idea that her radar contact had just become momentarily invisible to the people who were supposed to be protecting her. She was focused on the task at hand. Marcus, the mission leader, was radioing instructions to the formation. "All right, people, beginning engagement sequence now. Sarah, Joe, I want you to break formation and head toward the secondary coordinates. We're going to practice split-team tactics." "Copy that, lead," Sarah responded. Her voice was calm and professional, the way it always was when she was flying. The jet responded to her touch like it was an extension of her own body. She banked left, pulling away from the main formation. Joe Carlson followed, taking his position to her right and slightly behind. They were heading toward a section of the desert that had been designated for the exercise, an area with some natural rock formations that made for good landmarks and challenging navigation. The Nevada desert stretched out beneath them, vast and mostly empty. Just sand, rocks, and the occasional cactus. The kind of landscape that made you feel like you were flying over another planet. "Looking good out here," Joe radioed. His voice came through crisp and clear. "Beautiful day for a flight." "Copy that," Sarah responded. She adjusted her altitude slightly, dropping to 8,000 feet. The exercise called for them to engage a simulated target at this altitude. It was good training for low-level approaches, the kind of flying that would be important in real combat situations. Sarah was focused, she was good, and she was about to make the mistake of her life. It didn't feel like a mistake at first. It just felt like her instruments malfunctioning. The first sign was a slight vibration in the cockpit. Then the engine gauges started to fluctuate. Sarah immediately ran through her mental checklist, checking each system. The engine temperature was rising. The oil pressure was fluctuating. It was like something had suddenly gone wrong with the jet's power plant. "Lead, I'm getting some instrument fluctuations," Sarah radioed. Her voice remained calm, professional. "Engine readings are erratic, requesting guidance." In the command center back at Nellie's, alarm bells were going off. "We see it," Marcus responded. There was tension in his voice now. "Can you stabilize?" Sarah was already working on it. She reduced power, trying to get the engine temperature back under control. But the situation was deteriorating fast. What had started as a minor malfunction was escalating. The vibrations in the cockpit were becoming more severe. Her instruments were going haywire. "Engine's getting worse," Sarah reported. "I'm losing power on the main engines. Request emergency landing approval." This was the kind of moment that separated the good pilots from the great ones. This was the moment when training, instinct, and experience all came together. Sarah was already plotting her course back toward the base, calculating whether she could nurse the damaged jet far enough to get to safety. But then something else happened. The engine didn't just fail, it exploded. It wasn't a catastrophic explosion, not at first. It was more like a violent cough, a sudden surge of fire and metal that tore through the engine housing. Sarah felt the jet lurch violently to the right. Alarms screamed in her ears. Red warning lights flooded the cockpit. She fought for control, pushing the stick, trying to compensate for the sudden loss of power. The jet was falling now, dropping fast. She was still at high enough altitude that she could theoretically eject, but that wasn't the training talking anymore. That was something deeper, an unwillingness to give up, an instinct to keep fighting. "Lead, I've lost my main engine," Sarah reported. Her voice was steady, but it took everything she had to keep it that way. "I'm losing altitude fast, losing power to secondary systems." "Sarah, eject now," Marcus ordered. "That's an order, Captain. Get out of that jet." But Sarah didn't eject. Not yet. She was still fighting with the controls, still trying to nurse the crippled aircraft back toward the base. She had maybe a minute before the second engine failed, maybe a minute to get the jet to turn back toward Nellie's. Then the second engine died. The F-16 became a falling brick. The cockpit went dark except for the emergency lighting. Alarms screamed. The desert below, which had seemed so peaceful and beautiful just minutes ago, was now rushing up toward her at terrible speed. "Sarah, eject!" Marcus was shouting now. There was fear in his voice, real fear. Sarah's hand went to the ejection handle. She had trained for this 1,000 times. She had practiced the motions until they were automatic. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal handle. The jet hit the ground. The impact was catastrophic. The F-16 didn't hit nose first. It hit at an angle, the right wing catching a rock outcropping first. The jet cartwheeled, metal tearing and screaming, debris flying in all directions. The cockpit crumpled like a tin can. And then silence. In the command center at Nellie's, every alarm went silent. The radar screen showed 5 blips spread across the desert. Except there were only 4 blips now. One of them had simply stopped. It was no longer moving. It was no longer transmitting. The radar contact that had briefly flared and disappeared earlier had now disappeared permanently. "We've lost Sarah," Airman Tommy Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her jet just crashed." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was already on the radio. "All aircraft, we have a downed pilot. Coordinates being transmitted now. I want search and rescue mobilized immediately." On the monitors, emergency teams began to mobilize. This was a full-blown crisis now. And there, on the radar screen where Sarah's jet should have been, there was nothing but empty desert. In the wreckage below, beneath tons of twisted metal and fire, Sarah Mitchell had one thought before the world went black. It wasn't over yet. She wasn't done fighting. The search and rescue operation was massive. Within minutes of the crash, helicopters were in the air. Ground teams were being mobilized. The entire base was focused on one objective, finding Captain Sarah Mitchell. By sundown, they had located the wreckage. It took them another hour to determine that there was no way anyone could have survived the impact. The F-16 had come down hard with tremendous force. The cockpit, where Sarah would have been sitting, was crushed beyond recognition. The fire damage was extensive. Anyone in that jet would be dead. Everyone knew it, even though no one wanted to say it out loud. Except for one person who knew better. Sarah regained consciousness in darkness. Her first awareness was of pain. Her left arm was screaming. Her ribs hurt with every breath. There was blood in her mouth and something warm and wet running down the side of her face. She tried to move and realized she was trapped. The emergency ejection system had worked, but only partially. Sarah wasn't entirely sure what had happened in those final seconds before impact. Her memory was fragmented like looking at broken glass. She remembered reaching for the ejection handle. She remembered the violent lurch of the jet's nose dropping. And then, something, a jolt, a sudden change in direction, a sense of being thrown from the aircraft. She had ejected, but barely. The parachute had deployed, but there hadn't been enough time. She had been falling too fast, too close to the ground. The impact with the desert floor had sent her tumbling through a ravine, a deep cut in the earth that had probably saved her life. Her parachute had snagged on a rock outcropping about 20 feet down. The main wreckage of the jet was above her, burning. She could see the firelight dancing across the rocks around her. She was in a crevasse, basically a narrow canyon carved out by thousands of years of water and wind. The parachute was caught on a rock above her head. Her harness was tangled in the cords. Sarah forced herself to stay calm. Panic was the enemy right now. She needed to assess her injuries. She needed to figure out what was broken and what was just badly hurt. Her left arm was definitely broken. She could feel the bone grating when she tried to move it. She had a gash on her forehead that was bleeding pretty steadily, but head wounds always bled a lot. Head trauma didn't necessarily mean serious injury. Her ribs were bruised, maybe one or two cracked, but she didn't feel the kind of acute stabbing pain that would indicate a pneumothorax. That was good. That meant she could breathe. She worked at the parachute harness, fumbling with one hand. Her fingers were shaking, whether from pain, shock, or adrenaline, she couldn't tell. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, she managed to unbuckle herself from the harness. The relief of being free of the tangled cords was immediate, even though she hurt worse than she'd ever hurt in her life. Sarah pulled herself up out of the crevasse. It took all the strength she had. Her broken arm hung useless at her side. Her flight suit was torn in multiple places, and she could feel blood running down her leg from a gash on her thigh, but she was alive. More importantly, she was mobile. She climbed out of the ravine and saw the full extent of the disaster. The F-16 was a burning wreck, scattered across a wide area. Debris was everywhere. The smell of jet fuel and burnt metal filled the air. There was no way the crash teams could know she had survived this. No way anyone would think to look for her anywhere but in that wreckage. Sarah took stock of her situation. It was getting dark. She was injured and in the middle of the Nevada desert. She was also completely alone. No one knew she was alive. By now, they were probably calling it a recovery operation instead of a rescue. She thought about staying with the wreckage, knowing that the search teams would find it. But something in her gut told her that wasn't the right call. Her radio was destroyed. Her survival kit had been crushed in the ejection process. She had nothing but her flight suit, her wits, and her will to survive. Sarah started walking. Back at Nellie's Air Force Base, the mood was solemn. The search and rescue teams had found the wreckage and confirmed what everyone had feared. Captain Sarah Mitchell was dead. The crash had been fatal. There was no reason to continue active search operations. In the command center, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was reviewing the telemetry data from the flight, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The new radar system had picked up everything, or at least it should have. He was looking for the moment when the engines failed, trying to understand the sequence of events that had led to the crash. That's when he saw something strange. The telemetry showed that Sarah's engines had failed simultaneously, both at exactly the same moment. Not seconds apart, not one after the other, but at the exact same instant. That was unusual. Engine failures were rarely that synchronized. And according to the data from the pre-flight checks, both engines had been running perfectly fine just before the failure. Harrison called up the recorded radar data from the moment of the crash. He watched the blip representing Sarah's jet moving across the screen. He watched it start to descend. He watched the altitude reading drop, 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, and then something odd happened. There was a gap in the data, a moment where the radar couldn't track the jet. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was there, a blank spot in the telemetry. When the radar picked up the signal again, it showed Sarah's jet already impacting the ground. Harrison frowned. That shouldn't happen. The new system was supposed to provide continuous tracking. There were redundancies built in specifically to prevent gaps in coverage. "Chen," he called to the young radar operator, "can you pull up the raw radar data from the crash? I want to see what happened in the moments before impact." Tommy Chen was already on it. His fingers flew across the keyboard. "Pulling it up now, sir." The screen filled with technical readouts, range, bearing, altitude, velocity, and dozens of other data points. Harrison studied it carefully. Everything looked normal until there, a distortion. A spike in the radar signal that lasted only a fraction of a second. "What caused that interference?" Harrison asked. Chen shook his head. "I'm not seeing it in any of the system logs. There was no technical malfunction, no radar jammer signature. It's like something just temporarily obscured the signal." Harrison sat back in his chair. He had a bad feeling about this. Something didn't add up. The simultaneous engine failure, the gap in radar coverage, the strange signal distortion. He made a decision. "I want to maintain search operations," he said quietly. "And I want this data reviewed. I want someone from technical intelligence looking at this. Something's not right." "Sir," Chen said hesitantly, "the crash site has been confirmed. We've recovered. Remains. There's no reason to believe." "That's an order, Chen," Harrison cut him off. "Maintain search operations." In the Nevada desert, Sarah Mitchell was crawling toward a rocky outcropping in the distance. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. Her broken arm was starting to go numb. The gash on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but it had crusted over with dried blood. She was thirsty, exhausted, and running on nothing but the stubborn refusal to quit that had always defined her character. She didn't know that back at the base, someone was already starting to question whether she was really dead. She didn't know that when she finally collapsed behind the outcropping and fell into an uneasy sleep, the radar systems at Nellie's would pick up a signal. Just a faint pulse, barely distinguishable from the background noise, but there. A sign that maybe, just maybe, the impossible had happened. Sarah had spent the night barely conscious, drifting in and out of awareness. She had found a small cave behind the rocky outcropping, barely large enough to fit her body, but it had provided some protection from the wind and the cold. When dawn came, she forced herself to move. She needed water. She needed shelter. She needed to find civilization or die trying. As she was packing up to leave the cave, she noticed something strange. On the ground about 30 yards away, there were tire tracks, recent ones. Someone had been out here, not in a military vehicle, but in something smaller. A truck, maybe. Sarah followed the tracks with her eyes, and they led to what looked like a small equipment shed, half buried in sand and rocks. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't be civilian equipment out here. This was military training land. It was restricted, but there it was. Sarah limped toward the shed. Every step sent pain radiating through her leg and ribs, but she pushed through it. The shed's door was locked, but years of military training had taught her a thing or two about simple locks. She found a rock, broke the padlock, and went inside. What she found made her blood run cold. Inside the shed were electronic equipment and instruments she recognized immediately. Radar jamming systems, signal disruption devices, the kind of equipment that could create a gap in radar coverage, the kind of equipment that could knock a jet's engines offline. Her breath came faster, her heart was racing. This wasn't an accident. Her engines hadn't failed because of a mechanical problem. They had been sabotaged. Sarah's mind was whirling. Who would do this? Why? She was nobody special. She was just a pilot who had made some people uncomfortable with her presence. She was a woman in a man's world, but that didn't seem like enough reason to kill her. Unless... Sarah thought about the strange radar anomaly that had been reported. She thought about the simultaneous engine failure. She thought about the gap in telemetry. It all made sense now, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't about her. This was bigger than her. Someone had been testing this equipment. Someone had wanted to see if they could make a jet disappear from radar, if they could disable an aircraft remotely. And she had just happened to be the convenient test subject. Sarah examined the equipment more carefully. There were serial numbers on some of it, manufacturer codes, documentation. She tried to commit as much of it to memory as she could. She found a small notebook in the shed and a working pen, and she started writing down everything she could see. Back at Nellie's Air Force Base, the radar operations team had made another discovery. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had pulled every piece of data from the morning of the crash. He had been looking at it for hours, studying the patterns, the anomalies, the little things that didn't fit. And now he thought he had found something. The radar interference that had occurred during Sarah's flight hadn't happened by accident. It had a signature. It was the kind of interference pattern that only occurred when a specific type of jamming equipment was active. Equipment that wasn't supposed to be in use during training exercises. Harrison called in technical intelligence. He brought in Colonel Patricia Webb, a signals expert who had been with the Air Force for 28 years. He showed her the data without explaining what he suspected. Colonel Webb studied it for about 3 minutes, and then she sat back in her chair. "This is active jamming," she said quietly. "Someone was deliberately disrupting the radar signal." "Is that possible during a training exercise?" Harrison asked, though he already knew the answer. "Absolutely not," Webb said. She stood up and started packing. "Jamming equipment is locked down. It requires authorization from the base commander. There would be documentation, logs, everything. If someone used a jammer on this base, there would be a paper trail." "Check the logs," Harrison said. It took Webb about 45 minutes. When she came back to Harrison's office, her expression was grim. "There was a maintenance test authorized," she said, dropping a printed document on his desk. "For the new radar jamming system we're developing. It was supposed to happen, but the authorization is." Odd, it came from Colonel James Duncan. Harrison felt his stomach drop. Colonel Duncan was the deputy commander of the base. He was powerful, he was connected, and he was definitely not someone you wanted to investigate lightly. "Are you sure?" Harrison asked, even though he already knew the answer. "The signature matches his digital authorization codes," Webb said. "But here's the problem. According to the training schedule, the jamming test wasn't supposed to take place until the afternoon. Captain Mitchell's flight was in the morning. There's no logical reason why the jamming system would have been active during her exercise."